So I am thrilled to be sharing with you a little bit about our keynote speaker, Jon Erickson, who is the David Blittersdorf Professor of Sustainability Science and Policy at the University of Vermont. Back in March 2020, the early days of the pandemic, if you can remember those, a few VTIPL board members and myself had the opportunity to hear Jon speak in a national webinar. The title of that webinar was After the Pandemic, Designing a Just and Resilient Economy for All. When someone mentioned that Jon was from UVM, we all got very excited. Jon was speaking of right-sizing the economy. And as a former journalist, which I guess one never gets that out of one's system, I was furiously taking notes, and at every possible chance I would tell our board, remember, if it's such a time we're able to do this big conference, let's not forget Jon Erickson. And it wasn't a hard sell. So Jon has published widely on energy and climate change policy, land conservation, watershed planning, environmental public health, and the theory and practice of ecological economics. He was the interim dean of UVM's Rubenstein School of Environment and Natural Resources from 2012 to 2014, and managing director of UVM's Gund Institute for Ecological Economics from 2009 to 2012. Jon is past president of the U.S. Society for Ecological Economics and past editor of the Adirondack Journal of Environmental Studies. He serves on the Board of Advisory Committee of numerous non-governmental organizations. He is also currently an adjunct professor of the University of Iceland. So he not only brings his experience in North America, the United States, and this region, but also, I would say, a critical perspective from elsewhere in the world. He's also been a Fulbright Scholar in Tanzania and a visiting professor in the Dominican Republic and in Slovakia. Jon's books include The Great Experiment in Conservation, Voices from the Adirondack Park, Frontiers in Ecological Economics, Theory and Application, and Ecological Economics, a workbook for problem-based learning. And today, we are delighted that we're going to hear Jon's first preview of his soon-to-be-released book titled The Progress Illusion, Reclaiming Our Future from the Fairytale of Economics. Welcome. Thank you, Jon.
Thank you, Donna, and thank you, everyone. Thank you all for coming out on a beautiful Sunday, a beautiful day. It's been kind of rare recently, so I appreciate you all coming inside and participating in this conference today. So we are celebrating 50 years since the publication of Limits to Growth. So I too would like to start with a quote from Donella Meadows. If you Google Donella Meadows quotes, you get a lot to choose from. And every time I think I've got something smart to say, she has said it before. It was so much better than I could. But one of my favorite quotes, and it sort of frames my talk, is, "The world's leaders are correctly fixated on economic growth as the answer to virtually all our problems. But they're pushing all their might in the wrong direction." So that's really the frame of what I'd like to talk about today. And I've selected a few passages from this new book, The Progress Illusion. When I teach my large undergraduate course in ecological economics, usually on day one or day two, I start with this exercise where one side of the room is agree, the other side of the room is disagree. I put up a few statements and they have to vote with their feet. Don't worry, I'm not going to make you do this. But it sort of frames the class for me. And so I start with this where do you stand exercise, and I thought I'd share that with you so you get a sense of where this new generation stands on some of the issues that we'll wrestle with today. I always joke with them, every year I'm a year older and they're all the same age. But anyways, every year is a new generation, right? So across the blackboard, I denote this spectrum of opinion, right? Strongly agree to agree on one side of the classroom, disagree to strongly agree on the other side of the classroom, and in the middle, neutral. Students are asked to stand up, consider these series of 3 statements, and then vote with their feet across the rows of the lecture hall. So the first statement, so you can imagine where you would stand. Let's say this is agree and this is disagree, okay? The first statement is economic growth and environmental protection are fundamentally in conflict with one another. Where would you stand on that? Would you agree that they're fundamentally in conflict with one another? Would you disagree? Would you take the politician route and stand in the middle? On this hand, well, on this hand. I should say the economist route, that's how we're trained. On this hand, well, on this hand. So after round 1, as you might expect, shuffling happens and a predictable kind of bell-shaped curve materializes. So now the fun begins, because I asked them to stand and defend their position, including an invitation to walk their opinion anywhere they want if they're otherwise persuaded. So let's start with the disagree side. Okay, disagree with the statement that economic growth and environmental protection are fundamentally in conflict with one another. So on the disagree side of the distribution, students often concede, right, that growth is, as currently measured, has some degree of conflict with environmental protection. But they argue that, remember I used the word fundamental, they argue that it's not fundamental. They give examples of an economy growing in clean and green ways, through renewable energy, ecotourism, or the service sector more generally. Someone usually claims that demand for environmental protection comes from higher incomes, and that, quote, poor people, communities, or entire countries must first grow to deal with the very impacts of that growth. The conclusion from this disagree side of the room is that economies can grow in more efficient ways to limit environmental impact. There is a greener way. So the big clump in the middle, right? Most students are in the middle. They want more clarity, they want more discussion. They especially want more clarity over this word fundamentally. They'd like to redefine growth, right, as something else. Perhaps citing an example from a beyond GDP, gross domestic product discussion that they had maybe in an environmental studies class. Someone might quote a vague recollection of the Brundtland Commission or mention the UN Sustainable Development Goals, but admit that they've never really thought about the hand-waving of the sustainability discourse. The middle doesn't like the either-or nature of the statement. They want the benefits of growth, but not its costs. Yet they struggle with whether growing the economy forever, however defined, is possible or even desirable. So to the middle, they want a middle way, right? They want their cake and eat it too. So then there's the agree side. Agree that there is a fundamental conflict. And to this side of the room, especially the outlier or two who's like hugging the classroom wall, right? Growth is growth. They argue if an economy is growing, it must be further depleting and polluting a finite planet. Someone might even counter the green growth argument that they just heard with the so-called rebound effect, where efficiency makes resources cheaper per unit, so therefore we use more units, right? We deplete and pollute more the more efficient we become. An efficient machine might use half as much energy and so run twice as much time. Also, higher incomes may demand cleaner local environments, but continue to demand pollution-intensive goods from abroad. Green growth at a planetary scale, this side of the room claims, is an illusion because there is no away. So to them, we need not a greener way, not a middle way, we need a new way. So that's round 1 of this classroom discussion, right? And it opens up a whole series of questions that I get asked their professor to chew on all semester long. There are empirical questions about both the possibility and desirability of growth, or green growth, this Shangri-La of sustainable development. There are scientific questions about the Earth's capacity to provide resources and absorb waste at the current size of the global economy, let alone something that's bigger. And there are ethical questions about who benefits from the growth model, who pays the costs, and whether our single species should make room for the rest of life. So these discussions lead into the next statement, right? So I've warmed them up now. And the next statement is, and again, imagine agree, disagree, and where you might stand in a classroom of mine, okay? This next statement: there should be a limit to the amount of money that an individual can earn in today's society. There should be a limit, do you agree? There should be a limit to the amount of money that an individual can earn in today's society, or do you disagree? There should be no limits on the individual capacity to earn. So reactions to this round, reactions to round two, are actually visibly, always, I do this many semesters, more personal as students kind of confidently reshuffle their stance. Again, a bell-shaped curve materializes, but more are skewed to the agree side, at least in Vermont. It's a little more skewed to the agree side, for sure. The side that disagrees offers the usual cultural norms of a capitalist society, right? Limits on earnings subdue motivation, inhibit entrepreneurship, and stifle innovation. If you work hard, take risks, and play by the rules, then you deserve every penny you earn. It's the equality of opportunity that matters, not of outcome. You've all heard this story, right? That's what I was raised on. Those who strongly disagree tend to be quite skeptical about who would set these limits on income and how. Fair question. And besides, don't millionaires and billionaires give away lots of their money to charitable causes? Right? That comes up time and time again. Okay, so again, the majority's in the middle, but again, skewed a little more to the agree side. In the middle, these are like natural-born politicians, right? They want more clarity, especially on the word, this time, limit. How would you limit income? What would it look like? Now, as we discussed, if there are soft limits, such as progressive tax structures, with higher incomes paying higher taxes, some say they would drift over to the agree side. They like that idea. But if there's hard limits, including an imposed cap on income, many actually would join the disagree camp. Someone often argues that society's focus should instead be on lifting the unfortunate up from the bottom, not unfairly punishing the successful at the top. The question that they leave the room with is, could we better incentivize the wealthy to support just causes with their hard-won earnings? That's the middle. The proportion of students who agree with limiting income usually dive into the 1% narrative, right? Students at UVM love Bernie. They dive into the 1% narrative. This side is troubled with growing inequality in the United States and around the world. They often want to unpack the word earn. I love it when someone brings that up, right? Let the individual keep earned income from the sweat of their brow, but not capture the unearned returns from the work of others, investments of society, or the resources of the environment. Billionaires, this side argues, are only possible in an unjust society. Why should the tiniest fraction of the 1% decide whether and how to spend unearned income on tax-deductible causes? So this second round opens a discussion on what is fair, what is unfair. There are believe it or not, biological questions about the capacity of our social primate species to both compete and cooperate, something that I get into quite a bit in this book. There are institutional questions at the intersection of law, governance, and culture that determine which attributes of human behavior will be selected and reinforced. And there are political questions over who exactly is served by an old economics of narrow self-interest and white privilege versus a new economics of community well-being and reciprocity. So these first two stances are about the sustainable size and fairness of the economic system. They are well outside the purview of most economics classes, I can assure you. However, the final statement is squarely within the realm of a self-proclaimed science of choice. The final statement is free markets will ultimately solve our environmental problems. Massive migration to the disagree side. The bell curve is gone, right? Disagree side. Free markets will ultimately solve our environmental problems. So this march to the disagree side is determined with a clear majority quick to dismiss free markets as the panacea to environmental problem solving. Remember, these are 19, 20-year-olds. They voice concerns over alignment of short-term for-profit motives with long-term for-profit interests, or planet interests. Some want to believe that voting with their dollars can make a difference, but they're skeptical that consumer choice alone will solve the climate or extinction crisis. If I replace will ultimately with can help, then the bell curve materializes again. Right? Yeah. Markets can help, but will they ultimately be the go-to solution? There are folks in the middle, and the folks in the middle want clarification over the word free. What exactly do you mean by free markets, right? Does free imply absence of any and all government oversight? If so, they disagree. Let the market do its thing, but within clear boundaries set by society. They're a little more comfortable with that. They want voting by ballot to take precedence over voting by billfold. Right? They want society to envelop and constrain the economy. The center of the room wants to strike a balance between the invisible hand of the market with the invisible handshake of social norms and the invisible foot of government. If I strike free from my sentence to further modify the statements to markets can help, right? Again, most heads bob in agreement. Rarely does a student strongly advocate for a purely free market approach, at least at the University of Vermont, right? Although occasionally a student does sort of step out from under the peer pressure and makes the case. The agreed position usually stems more from distrust of government than from blind faith in markets. In a 20-year-old's voice, I can hear a parent, right, raised on Reaganisms in a culture that claims government rarely solves anything. If I replace free markets with government, the disagree side of the room barely budges, and any proponents of a market-based solutions eagerly join their colleagues, right? Government's not the answer. This is universal amongst our young people. Market's not the answer, government's not the answer. Where does this leave us? What do we do? My dichotomous education in action, right? So this third and final statement leads to questions over dichotomy of market and government. This opens up really rich discussions over the right scale of governance, the design of checks and balances in both private and public spheres, and a topic near and dear to my heart, the role of education in informing civic duty in a global society. As an economics education of I has crowded out a civics education of we, there's no shortage of questioning and rethinking our culture's bedtime stories. As novelist Ursula Le Guin wrote to her own students, there are no right answers to wrong questions. There are no right answers to wrong questions. The hope is that these polarizing statements inspire questions worth asking in building a new economics and indeed a new economy. Asking what minimum size of an economic system is needed to support flourishing livelihoods in an interdependent web of life is the right question. Likewise, asking what's fair and unfair in our economic relationships should preclude any delusions that just outcomes will magically emerge from a narrow model of self-interest. The answers won't be precise XY coordinates on a blackboard, which is what we've heard in Econ 101. But surely the wrong question is how to make markets more efficient to merely slow planetary destruction. The answers won't conform to a single story told from a chosen people. But surely the wrong question is how to sustain an economy that serves the wants of the few by forsaking the needs of the many. The answers won't be grow the economy to nearly every question asked, but surely doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result is, as Alcoholics Anonymous purportedly first said, a kind of insanity. So that's my inspiration for Donella Meadows and to question this kind of model of growth that we find ourselves with. All right, so that's the order. We're really here to talk about climate action, right? And it's wonderful to see this award that you all are pivoting to around environmental action or climate action more specifically. And classes like mine in ecological economics, where we often wrap the class around doing some sort of climate action project. In fact, our class designed and launched the first Youth Climate Action Summit in Vermont. We did this for 5 years in a row, partnered with Bernie Sanders, brought teams of high school students from around the state to their state university. Students worked on climate action plans, brought those back to their communities, and about year 3, year 4, the high school students created a Vermont Youth Climate Lobby, a Vermont Climate Congress, and they were basically like, University of Vermont, get the heck out of our way. We got this. And so we stepped back, and those activities got a little sidetracked with COVID, but I'm hoping they're coming back strong this year. Because to me and to my students, to design a new economy, we have to first consider the carbon question. The planet is warming because of growing human population and because of growing human economy. Period. Burning fossil fuels, catalyzing cement, raising livestock, converting forested soils from sinks to sources, all add up to more carbon than can be absorbed by the ocean and through photosynthesis. Carbon dioxide concentrations exceeded an average annual of 416 parts per million in 2021, a level not approached since the mid-Pleistocene warm period of the Pleistocene epoch, about 3 million years ago. When I speak to students at graduation, I name them the X parts per million class. And I say, that's the number that you have to remember. Kind of depressing, but it's true. This is beyond the level when the global average temperature was 3 to 4 degrees Celsius, 5.4 to 7.2 degrees Fahrenheit hotter than today, and when sea levels were 20 meters higher than today, over 65 feet. Within my own family, a lot of this book is a very personal reflection. Within my own family, I need only go back 6 generations to reach pre-industrial concentrations of 280 parts per million. 6 generations, that's it. Blink in geological history, right? When my maternal grandmother was born in 1908, CO2 emissions were just 300 parts per million. Again, today they are 416. When my grandmother was born, 300. The outer bound of all 11 interglacial intervals over the last 800,000 years. By the time my mom was born in 1943, the parts per million ticker was at 311. Pretty slow, 300 to 311. Then my lifetime. Since 1950, over the course of just my parents' generation, CO2 concentrations have grown more than 100 times faster than the interglacial warming of the entirety of the Holocene, the nearly 12,000-year geological epoch of the current era. The 2014 Fifth Assessment Report of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change concluded that humanity has already warmed the planet by 1 degree Celsius since pre-industrial times. The result has been, quote, multiple observed changes in the climate system, including, quote, more frequent heat waves, an increase in the frequency, intensity, and amount of heavy precipitation events at the global scale. When the first installment of the 6th Assessment Report dropped on August 9th, 2021, the physical science conclusions were even more dire. What UN Secretary Antonio Guterres called a code red for humanity. Believe it or not, I first engaged in climate change research. Climate change research has defined my career in 1991, in the initial months of graduate school. And the alarm bells then were already sounding, right? 1991. Sounding that the 1980s were the hottest decade on record. Then, of course, the 1990s broke that record. Then the 2000s broke that record. Then the 2010s, we're just coming out of, included 8 of the 10 hottest years ever recorded, with the droughts, fires, floods, and extreme weather events to show for it. Just consider the year 2019, just 2 years ago, 3 years ago, like something out of a science fiction movie. Fires in Australia consumed 25 million acres and killed over 1 billion animals. Extreme droughts in Central America displaced hundreds of thousands of people. The Southern Hemisphere suffered the 3rd deadliest tropical cyclone on record in March, matched 5 months later by the 2nd strongest Atlantic hurricane. Historic floods breached riverbanks throughout the United States during the wettest year in our recorded history. The Greenland ice sheet lost more ice mass than any year on record. The list goes on and on. The seas north of Alaska hit summertime temperature full 14 degrees Fahrenheit above long-term averages. So you know the common vocabulary that's emerged now, right? Terms like bomb cyclones, superstorms, megadroughts, polar vortexes. Climate scientists note that global warming isn't the singular cause of any single extreme event, but warn that it does dramatically change the odds. Record-breaking heat and drought that preceded Australia's 2019 fires were four times more likely under human-induced climate change than without. December 17th was the hottest Australian day by far in recorded history, averaging 105.6 degrees Fahrenheit for the continent, with the south central coast nearing 122 degrees Fahrenheit. Under a 2 degree Celsius global warming scenario, these extreme temperatures are 8 times more likely. That's the barrel we're staring into here. So I go on to talk about the 2 degrees and the hothouse Earth conclusions and panels of scientists who are warning us about what to do, right? And 30 years of agreements and treaties and targets, yet we can't seem to get our hands around this. Business as usual puts the planet on a course for a 3 to 5 degrees Celsius warming by 2100. Despite all the science, all the modeling, all the reports, we're on this path of a global economy still largely run on combustion of carbon fuels. When temperature records were broken year after year in the 2010s, so too were demands for oil, natural gas, and coal. Record demands for oil, natural gas, and coal. Global car sales hit all-time highs of over 97 million vehicles in 2017 and 2018. Coal-fired electricity grew 54% in China, 121% in India, and 50% in the rest of Asia between 2010 and 2018. Annual growth in natural gas consumption hit a new global high in 2018, with every region of the world consuming at record levels. Near the end of the 2010s, there were signs that global coal demand was leveling, but only by swapping one fossil fuel for another. Growth in renewable energy has taken a very tiny bite out of growing electricity demand, but investment in new capacity, new renewable energy capacity, was less than 1/4 of the $1 trillion spent per year on new fossil fuel exploration, extraction, and transportation. So thank you for your initiatives to divest, right? Because that's the source of this new investment. $1 trillion to go find new stuff. The International Energy Agency estimates that another 20 trillion of oil, gas, and coal development is quite literally in the pipeline through the year 2040. It's not slowing, gang. It's ramping up. And with high gas prices right now, the discourse is energy security through more fossil fuels. So the carbon question is, how far and how fast does the world economy need to cut carbon pollution to stay within this 1.5 to 2 degree threshold? More specifically, what's left to burn and what needs to stay in the ground? Very simple, right? What's left to burn and what needs to stay in the ground? The 2018 IPCC report on global warming of 1.5 degrees Celsius estimated that humanity has, here's the magic number, 580 gigatons of carbon dioxide emissions remaining for a 50-50 chance of staying within 1.5 degrees. With 2010 as the base year, net CO2 emissions would need to be cut 45% by 2030, 8 short years away, and reach net zero by 2050 for a possibility of no overshoot of 1.5. To stay within 2 degrees, it's even more aggressive change. So, back to my Donella Meadows quote. How do we pull this off? How do we stay within the carbon dioxide threshold? How do we stay within the temperature degrees threshold that the world scientific community has been hammering about for 30 plus years? What's the answer? Grow the economy. That's the answer. The near universal answer has been to grow the economy more efficiently with new technologies. The overarching storyline of green growth, modeled by all 116 IPCC scenarios, that puts us within a chance of staying below 2 degrees Celsius, say, grow the economy between 2 and 3% a year. The Hail Mary of the most trusted scientific synthesis on climate science and modeling is to decouple a growing economy from energy, materials, and resulting greenhouse gas emissions. This is appropriate for this place, the biblical emancipation project, right? To separate ourselves from the earth and economic growth from its resource base at unprecedented scale, scope, and pace. So here's the rub. It's certainly true that the ratio of economic output over input, efficiency, has improved for labor, energy, materials, land, and more. So you can say we're becoming more efficient. New technologies and know-how have helped the economy grow more efficiently in a very virtuous cycle. With more growth, there's more capital to invest in more research, more technology for more growth. With laser focus on the margin, the story holds up. Resource and pollution limits aren't seen as ultimate constraints to growth, but rather temporarily obstacles to overcome through technical progress, one small step at a time. But therein lies the rub between emissions limits and marginal gains in efficiency. The inconvenient truth is that increasing efficiency at the margin, the next step, doesn't necessarily lead to decreasing environmental impact in aggregate. The math says it doesn't work. If the next unit of labor or energy is more productive than the last, then each new unit of production is using less resources and spewing less pollution. However, if you zoom out to the global scale, which is the only scale that makes sense for climate change, or over longer time horizons, total depletion in pollution, you ready for this? Increase with efficiency. This is the challenge. As ecological economist Herman Daly described, quote, efficiency first sounds good, especially when referred to as win-win strategies, or more picturesquely as picking the low-hanging fruit. But in fact, putting efficiency first makes frugality less necessary. Humanity has become more efficient at mining for minerals, so guess what we do? We mine more. We're more efficient at burning fossil fuels, so what do? We burn more fossil fuels. Generation after generation, we have become more efficient at farming the land, fishing the sea, drilling for oil, so we farm more land, fish more sea, and drill, baby, drill. Remember that quote? The hockey stick diagrams, okay, of the great acceleration of this time that we live in right now, of global depletion and pollution have accelerated to meet the demands of more people and more economy because we're more efficient at plundering the earth. I've done the math, gang, and I can't avoid that conclusion. We slow down or reverse course only when a resource collapses or when the economy contracts. This is this rebound effect that we've known for a long time how it works and what it looks like. It's called Jevons paradox. It goes back to 1865 when this guy Jevons was trying to figure out why are we becoming more efficient at using coal but using more coal than ever? What the heck's going on? So I got some of the math that shows why this is the case, and I'll just skip through that and get to the punchline here. There's a lot going on behind the scenes of these IPCC scenarios, lots going on green growth, lots of technological assumptions that are built in. Former US President Barack Obama himself boasted in a 2017 essay in Science that, quote, CO2 emissions from the energy sector fell by 9.5% from 2008 to 2015, while the economy grew by more than 10%. See, we can do it. What he's not including is the pollution that's embedded in all our trade. We grow more efficiently through new technology, but also by exporting the waste from our high consumption lifestyles. So if you just do the math and embody the pollution in our consumption, different story altogether. At best, we've seen a mild relative decoupling of growth and CO2 emissions. At worst, they're actually hand in hand. The more we grow, the more emissions we spew. Again, the IPCC scenarios that say that we can do this 2 degrees all assume a 2 to 3% growth rate per year, every year, into the foreseeable future. The other trick to do this is a huge technological assumption that they call bioenergy with carbon capture and storage. Remember that. BECCS for short. It's the genie in the bottle. Bioenergy with carbon capture and storage, right? It's the last-ditch effort. And what we do is we grow the global economy while capping carbon, and we do this by planting, harvesting, and burning massive tree plantations for energy, then capturing and storing CO2 emissions on-site, underground, for eternity. This is IPCC, gang. This highly speculative solution, not proven, would require 15,000 negative emission bioenergy plants worldwide, fueled by tree plantations covering more than 2 times the size of the subcontinent of India. Are we that addicted to growth that's the price we're willing to pay? So, in conclusion, this goes into our climate action plans. Invest in efficiency, invest in technology, and continue to grow. Assuming BECS, this magical assumption of new technologies that haven't been proven or let alone brought to scale yet, allows the IPC to say to their political class, we can do this. And politicians love this as a climate action plan because it doesn't require any action. The narrative assumes that technological advance in wealthy importing countries will eventually take hold in poor exporting countries. Higher incomes and changing preferences will eventually shift lifestyles to greener consumption. No evidence of any of this happening. Profit motives and self-interest will eventually leave carbon in the ground. Business as usual will eventually get the job done. To look for a more honest assessment, you gotta dig. For example, an analysis of these scenarios by the Institute for Economic Thinking states that the road to hothouse Earth is paved with good intentions. They conclude that you can't do it with these marginal incremental improvements in efficiency and energy, but you gotta do it with massive structural transformation, and you gotta get off economic growth as a central organizing principle of society. Their unavoidable conclusion is that, quote, establishment economics lacks the instruments and approaches to analyze exactly this. A genuine response to the carbon question requires a hard break from the past, especially the core economic logic of perpetual growth, technology saviors, and colonial power. The good news, I wish I had more time with you all, is there are plenty of anti-establishment approaches to choose from where growth is no longer sacred, green, or not. And Marta Cerrone and I hope to get into some of that in our workshop. I will definitely end there. Thank you.
Jon, we have a portable microphone
Sure.
here. If I can get it off. And people would like to ask a couple questions.
Yep. Is it working?
I just wondered if you could elaborate more on population growth and the impact.
Yep, so population times consumption, right, gives us these impacts. So it's consumption per person and the amount of people. So you can't avoid the math. What a newborn American will consume over his or her lifetime dwarfs most societies, including European societies, by far. So one of the biggest population growth problems that we have is here in the United States. And certainly we have population growth problems worldwide, especially to a group of people in the so-called global south who by all measurements are trying to catch up with us. Math doesn't work.
We've got time for maybe 2 questions.
Thank you very much. I'm wondering if you could speak on appropriately capturing negative externalities, appropriate budgeting, and how I know Herman Daly and John Cobb wrote a book about that 30 years ago, I found, and wondering if that is progressing in economics so that we do a true accounting and how important we feel that that would be.
Yeah, thank you for that question. Yeah, they wrote a beautiful book called For the Common Good in 1989, and I talk about that book, and Herman has written the foreword to my book, so I really see myself as sort of riding his coattails, if you will. And his work with John Cobb, a really noted theologian. Yeah, I mean, where I land in the last chapter of my book, when I get into the kind of solutions of the mess we're in, is this notion of radical pragmatism. Radical pragmatism. Pragmatic thing came from Jon D and Vermont, right? And all this, but the idea of radical pragmatism is that it's much like Bill McKibben has said. We don't have silver bullets. We need silver buckshot. We're going to have to try a whole bunch of things all at once, while keeping an eye on the radical part is pulling away the power from the status quo, right? But I'm in favor of carbon taxation. Is it the silver bullet? Absolutely not. Does it start to kind of shift the socio-political landscape? Absolutely, and there's evidence that all around the world it has, and here in the US, where we're stuck on 18.4 cents a gallon federal tax since 1993, the last time it was raised, we're not going anywhere. We're just not going anywhere. Okay, so these gas prices that we're paying now are still 40 to 50% below global averages, pre-pandemic, right? Pre-supply chain shortages, pre-Ukrainian conflict. So that's an example of taxing carbon, ramping that tax up, dealing with the regressive impacts of that tax with the money that you receive, right? To start to kind of wean us off of fossil fuels. The challenge is we're beyond weaning at this point, right? We need some radical change. So the radical change that I described in the book is around community organizing. It's around collective learning and collective practices. It's a moving away from this hyper-individualism, away, all the things my students were saying, away from the market knows best, to people in small churches in Vermont getting together and rolling their sleeves up and getting stuff done.
Okay, one last question.
Hi, I was hoping you'd be able to talk about scarcity in the model of reduction of economic growth for environmental impact.
Yeah, I mean, that question, maybe that's why you're asking, it could go in lots of different directions, right? I mean, in some sense, scarcity is the rule. In another sense, economics makes scarcity, creates scarcity, right? Putting prices, especially moving things that weren't in the marketplace and moving them into the marketplace, creates scarcity. So another of the things that is happening, especially coming out of the pandemic, is we're again talking about the care economy. We're talking about communities. We're talking about non-paid work, right? We're talking about work in our communities, work in our churches, work in our homes that aren't part of the marketplace, right? But when we create a society or a structure of an economy where the only way to get by is for both parents to work 60-hour weeks to pay the bills, right? That creates a kind of scarcity that didn't exist a generation ago, right? My parents' generation, my grandparents' generation, right? We create scarcity by turning things like the care economy into the market economy. And then we celebrate that scarcity by saying you're a good economic citizen by putting your kid into childcare and getting back to work, gosh darn it. These are the kinds of questions. And this is the moment right now in our history coming out of the pandemic when finally labor is saying, enough's enough. I'm not working for that. I'd rather stay home. I'd rather sleep on a couch. I'd rather sell my house and move in with somebody else. I'd rather adjust my lifestyle than to work that hard, right? That's moving away from scarcity and moving into an economy of plenitude.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you, Jon.
Thank you.